Welcome back to another episode of the Heroes Veritas podcast. I'm your host, Tim Bass, and today I am here with the amazing, the talented, the prolific Ryan King, Wisdom of Kings Instagram page, writer on masculinity and manhood, leadership, relationships. Thank you so much for joining us, Ryan. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to add value to my audience.
I appreciate you having me, man. I'm glad to be here.
So we kind of came across each other's pages kind of by happenstance on Instagram because we were kind of in that same space.
Yeah.
And I've shared with you, I've been an admirer of your comportment, of your leadership, of your presence within the social media space since I found your page. And we just kind of had a great connection right off the bat and started, having great conversations that I really can't thank you enough. So I knew you needed to be on the podcast at some point because people can really benefit from your voice. And I want to give that platform to you, even if it's 1 to 2 more people than what you already have, because you're doing such a phenomenal job in the social media space already.
I appreciate it, man. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just kind of figuring it as I go along.
And I think that lends to the legend, in my opinion, because I think so many people, and I've talked about this before on my social media, they see people such as yourself and they think that you've got it all figured out, and there's some kind of a genius level work ethic and mindset up there. And the reality is, I like to tell my clients all the time, like, we're too close to our legends, and the people that used to be doing legendary shit that we know in the mystical legends of old, we kind of create this thought process like they knew what they were doing the whole time. But in reality, they were just dealing with hurdles as they came their way. They were addressing and, perceiving the world as best as they could. And to my point earlier of what I said, like, I admire your comportment because, as you said, you don't know what the fuck you're doing, but you comport yourself in such a manner that you have a true knack for leadership. You have a true knack for discernment. You have a gift with words. I absolutely love the way you position your posts. So, kudos to you, because if you didn't say that, nobody would know, which is, I think, the mark of a true artist, for lack of a better term.
Thank you. It's weird to even be thinking like in those terms. I've never considered myself an artist or a writer or any of that stuff until I started writing on Instagram, and other people were the ones that described it that way, and I was kind of taken aback. I was like, well, I guess maybe I am an artist, but I just never thought of myself that way. But
I recently had a similar experience. Somebody referred to me as a poet on my Instagram. They said the way you articulate things is so poetic, it's so profound. And it took me back similar. I was like, I don't know if poet is the way I would describe myself. But it was cool. It was kind of a cool little, perception is reality when you think about the world at large. Whether you accept it or decline it, that's up to you. But it was kind of a little bit of a mind turner of me, kind of thought provoking, of like, poetry, maybe I can get into that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's kind of an interesting, kind of a timely conversation too, like writer, poet, artist, because recently in the masculinity space especially, there's kind of been a renaissance, for lack of a better term, of trying to get back to masculine artwork, trying to get back to like masculine creativity. Yes. The conversation I had with Jeff Pease that we're releasing tomorrow, at the time that we're recording this, we were talking about that, how samurai were these devout and deliberate warriors. They were extremely intentional, and they developed their skill set to the same degree that they developed their creative side, their poetry, their art, their calligraphy. And part of that was almost like a mental and emotional detractor from the warrior ethos, an ability to take the armor off and truly calm the spirit, calm the mind. And I've seen a lot of, in the masculinity space, men's space, a lot more movement towards trying to get back to that masculine creativity space.
Yeah.
Because we have seen writing, poetry, artwork, sculpting, all those things have become a very effeminate construct for a lot of men, and a lot of men will stray from it or avoid it entirely from fear of damaging their own insecure masculinity.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely, even for me, when I was described, as an artist, it took me a second to really process that and realize, like, I wasn't afraid to admit it. It just had never crossed my mind to even go there as a man, thinking of myself as an artist. But as soon as I was exposed to it, I was like, you know what? I do like art. This is pretty cool. Like, I'm not ashamed to admit that. I just think it's so foreign for a man to even go there in his thoughts of embracing the idea of wanting to be an artist or wanting to be, um, and I think that's pretty recent. I mean, I don't know when that started exactly. Um, but I do think it's interesting how there is kind of a new movement to see, what, we need to have people, and we need to have masculine people in all these spaces, whether it's sculpting or writing or poetry or um, whatever it may be. I think those things are important, and there's still been some things that we've considered artistic, um, that men haven't really avoided. Like being a writer. I don't feel like anybody who's ever looked at that as being feminine. Feminine.
No, but
Ernest
I
Hemingway.
think that the construct by which we look at a masculine writer versus a effeminate writer, right? Like fantasy is tend to be like that nerdy geeky side, right? Like it's not that it's effeminate as much as it's less masculine, right? Like it's not considered um, a strong parallel for men,
Which I think
versus
is
a
just
man that does, a guidebook, a man that does a sports book, a guy that does like that. Like there's almost like a subjective, like right isn't creative artistically as masculine unless it comes with figures and numbers and sports and things that are within a masculine space. But once you start moving into um, thought patterns that go above and beyond that, right? Like your poetry, soliloquies, haikus. You get into fantasy writing, romance novels, and things of that nature. Um, it is very. I would say that there are certain spaces, and I wouldn't say,
even the
uh,
aesthetics and beauty, like it's just
yeah.
been very recent, that I've seen a lot of content being put out by men saying, you know what, there's nothing wrong with creating something beautiful, which I thought was really interesting. Um, and
I
I
think I've
agree.
always had. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. You just
You're good.
struck a chord with me.
I, I as soon as I heard it, I was like, you know what? Damn right. Like that's
Yeah.
so true. I don't know how that happened. But there is something, I mean, to me, what I think is the most masculine is just doing something well, putting something into your craft you care about and doing it to the very best of your ability. That's
Oh,
masculine,
absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
you can apply that to um, sculpting. You can apply that to your appearance. You can apply that to aesthetics. You can apply that to anything. To me, I don't think it's very masculine to be sloppy with it, to
Oh,
not be
I
fit.
would argue it's contrary.
It is, well, it's kind of this weird paradox because most men, most modern men think it's feminine to care about how you dress or, you know, how you make yourself appear. Um, but at the same time, we don't really respect men that look sloppy. And so which one is it? You know what I mean?
I
So yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's an interesting topic to think about and ponder.
and you said something there that like it is paradoxical. It's very paradoxical, right? Like you have men who, and I've talked about this in the past with a number of people where it annoys me that a a a man will leverage masculinity as an excuse to rob him of responsibility to take care of himself, right?
Absolutely.
Like I'm allowed to be overweight because if I wasn't overweight, then that would mean I care about myself. Therefore, I'm metrosexual. Therefore, that's not masculine. I'm allowed to not clean my beard and wear clothes that fit me. And I get to wear dirty clothes because I'm a guy who, like, why wouldn't you? And I've always taken offense to it because it is counterproductive to the meritocracy that men follow, right? Because the meritocracy that men follow is your hierarchy within that space is based on the asset and the value that you bring to your tribe. And your looks are part of that. Like, how functional are you if you you look slovenly, you look messy, and you make us look bad, because now you are effectively reducing the caliber of men that we have in our space by association. And
Well, it's even like it goes back to just really, really basic stuff that I remember being taught as a kid, like first impressions matter, like really, really basic 101 stuff, right? Like first impressions matter. If first impressions matter, I think all men, it's very masculine, objective, like factual statement. Like first impressions matter.
yep,
All men agree on that. Well, your first impression is predominantly judged by your presentation of yourself.
100%. Yeah.
Period. So how does that jive? How does not how does that not create conflict with the idea that being metrosexual is a negative thing? Like those two things can't coexist. You got to pick one.
They truly can't. Yeah, 100%. And one of the things you mentioned earlier when I cut you off, and I apologize for that, that really struck a chord, was the art thing, and how we didn't think about putting ourselves in that category, but once you do, you realize how much it fits and how necessary it is. And the thing that triggered in my head is, like, ultimately there's this idea that masculinity is, and men are driven to take chaos and bring order to that chaos. I mean, we venture out to the perimeter and we create order in that space, and that's how we create the kingdoms and span the empires, and that's how men have functioned. That's how we're neurologically designed. How is that not art?
Yeah.
Art by design is, for lack of a better term, is a masculine construct, because you are quite literally taking something chaotic and you're creating an order to it. You are applying your will to it. You're applying your creative will to it and saying,
Well,
this is now reordered.
You take a concept that, like what I try to do with my writing is I'll take a concept that a lot of people might not understand or might be misunderstood or doesn't have nuance. And it very much feels like it's mentally draining for me because I'm not ripping somebody off, because a lot of these ideas that I haven't created order out of them yet. They're chaotic in my own head. And so I'll create order out of the chaos during the writing process. And it is very mentally draining. And so I agree. And, one of the things I think is interesting, and I don't remember where I heard it, but I've reflected on it quite a bit since I was kind of introduced to the concept is, masculinity has lost its way in culture, obviously. Culture is predominantly defined by art. If you think about, if you classify
100%. 100%.
magazines, all these things, like our art is an expression of our culture, and men have left the space of creating art, and that void has been filled by things that aren't masculine or things that are more feminine. And all of our art is being made by, not all of it, but too much of our art is being made by people that aren't masculine or don't agree with masculinity or are opposed to masculinity. And then you wonder why our culture has a lack of masculinity. Well, all of our art is being made by people that either aren't masculine or actively oppose masculine concepts.
You can't see that any deeper and more profoundly than in media, specifically commercials, television shows, and movies. If you look at, I had this conversation recently where there's this conflation point, this convergence point in culture, 80s into the 90s, where men went from being the heroes to the plucky sidekicks to the quirky, nerdy guy. The build stopped being of physical prowess and they start being of lean, kind of meek, almost docile.
Or funny, or the silly funny guy.
Yeah, they're the sidekicks, right? There's no longer the hero ethos, the mechanism for like the save the day kind of like Bruce Willis, Arnold Schwarzenegger style guys. It's now the Seth Rogen's, which is the degree of like funny, out of shape, just kind of like benign, right? There's no threat of like anything from that guy because it's just very benign. Or the I forget his name, but the scrawny guys that play, like in the like super bad and things like that. Like that's how we are portraying our men, and to that same degree, I can't watch most television shows, commercials, and movies anymore without some form of contempt when the male character comes on the screen, because like commercials, guys like,
Real bad.
I still don't know how to do laundry. Like,
Yeah.
you make them sound stupid. Like they couldn't figure out how to throw clothes into a washer, put detergent in, and push a button. Like it's not rocket science. And so this idea, to your point, of art is historically how culture defined themselves and how cultures get defined after we're gone, right? Like you look at Greek mythology, you look at Roman mythology and history, almost everything we know of these cultures was contingent on us reading their art after the fact.
Absolutely.
And so
No
you
question.
look at today's society and you're like, you look forward, and I literally just had this conversation probably 2 days ago. What are they going to find in our society? Dog filters?
Yeah.
Like we have
Yeah.
cultures of Renaissance of thought, paintings, and like we don't have the Baroque period in modern time, right? Like we have postmodernism, which has been largely like abstract work that does nothing for cultural divide and or cultural dissemination. It's literally a disconnect, like a subjectivism, right?
Mhm.
And it struck a chord with me. So this conversation is really profound for me because it's something that I've been contemplating quite a lot recently, which is what are the annals of time going to read about, quote unquote, our modern day culture
Yeah. Because
300
all we
years from
really
now?
have left, when you think about the Greeks, all we really know about them was what the artists made. We don't really know how much their culture was actually like that. We're assuming a lot because of what people wrote and the sculptures they created and the architecture and things they built. But that's all we have to go off of. And
Right.
so it's really interesting to think like if modern day America ceased to exist and 500 years from now somebody came along and was using archaeology and our writings to come up with a conclusion as to what America was like, it would be a very different picture than what you and I actually have lived,
Oh yeah.
because men have not contributed to that part of culture in so long.
Mhm.
And it's easy to point the finger and blame that we've been pushed out, but in a lot of ways, we haven't even tried to be part of it because we didn't feel like it was manly to do it. So we've
Well,
just kind of avoided the space.
that really goes
All,
back
and
to
all that's
responsibility.
all that's really left, you mentioned the movies and the sidekicks and stuff. The only masculinity thing that's left is this really, either the goofy sidekick or this really, really dumbed down, hyper masculine red pill guy. Like you got the Fast Five movies with Vin Diesel and all those guys. And it's like there's no depth of thought. You can't imagine, can you imagine Vin Diesel in the Fast and the Furious movies, painting something?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
everybody would laugh about it, right? And so
Right.
the only thing that's left that's masculine are these things that are very, just hyper aggressive, and there's no nuance to it. And then you wonder why the only types of men we have in society are either the hyper masculine guys that have no depth, have no ability to empathize or have compassion, have a very difficult time coexisting with any other human beings, whether it's their wife or their coworkers, because they're so, you know, they only see this caricature of what a man is.
Right.
And then you have the soft man on the other end of the spectrum. It's just the goofy sidekick. And there's what I'm trying to do with a lot of my content is try to, thread that needle of, yeah, I'm interested in hyper masculine stuff. I can do hyper masculine stuff, but I also read a lot. I also have put a lot of work into my relationship and understanding my wife. I try to be open minded about things while also being strongly convicted about those same things. Have very strong opinions, but hold on to them weakly, so that
Yeah.
you know you're able to keep adapting. And so that to me is what I'm trying to bring, um, is trying to bring these pieces together in a way that men, regardless of where they're starting at, can relate to in some way and say, you know what, I'm okay with that. I can model that,
Mhm.
because it doesn't require, for the hyper masculine guy, you don't have to completely lose your masculinity to make progress towards the center of, you know, you need to be able to be compassionate and soft with your spouse. You know, you need to be able to be tender with your wife. That's not the place to bring your hyper masculinity. It's not going to work. You know, on the flip side, for the men who are softer, who aren't as naturally aggressive, you know, how can you speak to them in a way that gets them to the table where they can say, you know what, I can see myself being that kind of man that is stronger, but it doesn't require me forsaking my identity as someone who likes music or who likes to be creative or who doesn't necessarily feel like he fits in with the jocks and the football players and all that. Like there's a space for all different types of men at the table, and you need all the different types of men to be at the table if we're going to make any progress um, towards being part of the dialogue of culture moving forward. Because right now, men just don't even have a seat at the table at the moment in the big picture of culture.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head previously of there's this general, most have a recompense against society because they believe that they were pushed out. But the reality is you didn't try to stay.
Yeah.
There was no attempt to remain. There was anything, and I believe that this is to your point of like that hyper masculine side where if anything even tiptoed towards the line of effeminate and femininity, guys would go, oh, that's for girls, like I'm done. And then we would almost feel shame for liking it and walk away from it. And there was no attempt by more discerning, more leader driven men and men in general to say, no, like that's cool. Like I get that women do this stuff, but I like it and that's okay.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Like it's fine. And then that would have maintained that place or that placeholder for us to say like, yes, there are effeminate things in it, but there's also masculine things in it. And here's the masculine side versus what I believed happened to your point is like nobody fought for it. They were just like, yeah, that's the girl stuff. Like this, that's not a guy's
Well,
place.
I think men got busy for the same reason that men only tend to read self-help books or books about, you know, numbers or objectives or sports. Like men
Utility over
got busy.
recreation.
What'd you say?
Utility over recreation.
Yeah, and men got so utilitarian and so focused on making money or you know building their careers or you know these very few categories that they just weren't part of the conversation anymore.
That's a fair point.
You know, I mean, they
Like
just
how do you balance a hyper utilitarian space with a
because there's no money to be made in art. That's the problem.
yeah.
Is there really isn't money to be made in art.
And
You know,
it doesn't even serve in the less, it doesn't serve in even the non-monetary sense, right? Like you said, like men tend to lean towards self-help books. That's time spent developing utility.
hmm
Art in that downtime, there's this general proclivity for men to look at it and go, but I could be spending time building something. I could be spending time developing myself, making more money, building out my empire. I feel like I'm running out of time as a man.
yeah.
So I don't have the time to waste. Maybe it's a calibration issue
I mean,
of what's wasting time versus what is leveraging useful time.
I think I think part of the reason there's a lot of men that don't want to be part of the masculine space is that that's not interesting to everybody. Like, not everybody wants to be doing something useful constantly. And like the fact that we even have that on our radar is a function of something to me that I think is wrong with our society. Like, everybody needs to rest. Like, men burn themselves out. You know, you see a lot of these men that are hyper masculine when they hit their 40s, when they hit their 50s, they hit a brick wall where they can't produce anymore. Their entire identity is wrapped up in production and accomplishments and utility, and they don't spend any time in investing in their health and their happiness and things like joy and peace and being able to just sit alone in a room with your thoughts. I mean, those things are important, and what a lot of men are learning the hard way now is that you get in your 40s and 50s and you burn yourself out and and the bottom falls out from underneath you. I know so many men. I went through phases where I had severe depression. And so many of the high performing men that I know in the business world. So in my business, it's all business, it's all B2B. And so all of my connections are other business owners. I don't deal directly with consumers. So everybody that I deal with is on the at least spectrum of high achievement. If you're a business owner, you're on the end of the spectrum that's high achieving. And I can't tell you how many men, as soon as I admit that I've dealt with depression or burnout, or I've had times where I've had breakdowns where I just had nothing left. My gas tank was empty. I could put the pedal to the floor as hard as I want to. I'm not going anywhere because I am burned out. And as soon as I admit that, I can't tell you how many men that are high achieving dudes that have said, "Oh, I can't believe you're going through that. I'm actually going through that right now. Like, can you help me? How are you getting over that?" And that's like this secretive thing that men won't admit to, especially high achieving men, is that a lot of men burn out because it's not realistic to be exclusively utilitarian all the time. Like, you are a human being. There's a time, just like the Bible says, there's a time to reap and a time to sow. We do as men is we think we've got to sow constantly. So you can't ever just sit back and relax and enjoy what you've built. Like, you feel guilty about it, like you're doing something wrong if you just sit back and reap what you've built. Like, just sit back and enjoy the day. Spend a weekend doing nothing except what you want to do. There's nothing wrong with that. And you need that to recharge, to go back out and fight more battles.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see men talking. The only men I see talking about that are the ones that are trying to appeal to the more effeminate men. None of the masculine men are telling other masculine men, "Bro, chill, do nothing this weekend and relax and enjoy what you've built with your family. Just recharge." Nobody's giving men permission to do that. And that's a problem.
So I have a couple questions, because I agree 100%. I hit that same wall, and I talk about it often, where I had my mental breakdown. It put me in the hospital,
Yeah.
and it was because I was doing too much for too long, and my body physically took and hit that wall, and it was the same thing. I had my identity wrapped up in my utility, and when my utility got taken from me for even a short time, it wrecked me. It absolutely wrecked me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a big proponent, because of a mentor that I had. He used to say there's no creation without recreation. And if you're trying to build an empire, you need to have time where you're not fighting fires so that you can dream bigger. And that really resonated with me. However, some of the struggles that I've seen both with my clients and people I've spoke to online that I would love to hear your input on is what happens when you attempt to elicit and implement recreation for yourself, and you have a partner, a family member, a business partner, a business relationship that is not willing to do that without creating additional storms. Like, what would your recommendation on how do you handle when you're trying to take that recreation for yourself and nobody around you can see why or that it's necessary, and it creates additional havoc for you for doing that?
For me, it comes down to communication. As a man, men tend to be really bad communicators because we think it's effeminate to talk. For me, I've always had to be a good communicator because being in sales, owning a business, all I do is talk to people. So I, I'm not very masculine when it comes to the way I communicate because I over communicate intentionally as a byproduct of what I've learned professionally. So, in to answer your question about the people in my life, like with my wife, for instance, there were times where I would work my ass off all weekend and I have nothing left. I don't have anything. The best I have to offer is to lay next to you and watch a movie. I can't talk to you for 2 hours about what's been going on with your day. Not today, at least. I'm exhausted, and to me, the remedy for all of that is, number one, is it real or is it a cop out? If you really need rest, then you should be able to verbalize why you need rest. And so the solution for me is explaining to my wife, or to my boss, or whoever it is, and say, listen, I'm like a predator. A predator spends a very short time period exerting a lot of energy to feed itself, and then it rests and recuperates. I can't sprint a marathon. You're either a sprinter or a marathon. And for me, I'm a sprinter. So I'm very vocal with the people, with my boss. If I would, with the bosses that I haven't had a boss in about 10 years, so I haven't spent much time having a boss. I'm a very high performing guy. So when it came to my bosses, I said, listen, I'm going to bust my ass for 5 hours today, and I'm going to go get more done in that 5 hours than everybody else is going to get done in 8. So if you see me sitting around, it's because I already got everything done. Deal with it. And if you're good enough at what you do, then your boss don't have a problem with it, because I would sell more in 5 hours than everybody else did in a week. So I earned that. And so I think some of it is, you need to have the fruit to show for yourself. With my wife, I said, for the first 5 years of our marriage, I set her down very early on and said, the next 5 years are mommy time. I have nothing to contribute to a 2-year-old. Like, I'll sit and play with them for 45 minutes to an hour. That's all I've got. My time with them is going to be when they're 12, 13, 14, and it's time to talk and teach them how to be men. I need you to hold the fort down these first 5 years. And the deal that I'll make with you is that if you'll hold the fort down and support me while I go bust my ass, I'm not going to have much to offer in my free time. I'm going to be exhausted. It's just going to be survival. But the deal I'll make with you is that if you give me that 5 years, we'll have a life after that like nobody else had. And I communicated that with her early on. We bought in, and she bought into that with me. And I went and made that exact thing happen. So to me, it comes down to just setting expectations and actually doing what you say you're going to do. And as long as you set the expectations, and you're consistent, and you do what you say you're going to do, then those storms and that friction doesn't really come up very often, because you've told them ahead of time what was going to happen. You made it happen. And there really isn't, I haven't personally had many instances where it's created friction, but that's because I addressed that stuff on the front end. I knew that if I didn't address it, it could create friction in the future. So I was proactive about saying, here's what I'm about to do. Here's what to expect. Here's what I need. And as long as you address those things, I haven't really had many instances where it's created friction, because I've gotten ahead of it.
I really like what you said, is it's in the fruit. And I think a lot of people fail to realize how much you have to deliver on your word, right? Going back to masculine integrity, if you say you're going to do something, you have to do it.
Yeah.
And to your point, there's not a lot of masculine guys out there telling guys to take the break, right?
And when you do, sorry to interject.
No, go ahead.
When you do keep your word, what happens is that you get a lot of grace in those moments of friction, because they know if something went wrong, if you've consistently kept your word and something went wrong, they know that it wasn't unintentional. That's a very important distinction. If they know you're a man of your word and something doesn't work out, they know it's not because you just didn't try or you didn't care. They know it's because it wasn't intentional. So I've gotten a lot of grace in a lot of areas where other men might not, because of the things that I've done right and delivered.
Yeah, 100%. And that grace is super critical. But to your point earlier, you mentioned that there's not a lot of masculine speakers talking about the recharge, the taking the break, and the breather. And I wonder if the reason for that is because so many use it as an excuse, as you mentioned before,
Yeah.
where they don't have the fruit. They aren't being honest. They aren't holding to their word. They're not, they get a mile into a marathon and then they quit. And then they're like, well, why don't you trust me to do what I say I'm going to do. Well, you only made it a mile. You said you were going to go a marathon. Like, that's not the same thing. Like,
Mhm.
yes, you're probably tired, but that's not what you said you were going to do. And so now you have this contention between whoever you're communicating to on your team, whether that's a significant other, or that's a business partner, or that's a business, like a boss. The fruit is going to be what gives you the grace and gives you the opportunity to take those recharge days. Um,
Mhm.
Not to say things have to be earned, but I mean, to a certain degree, things have to be earned,
Yeah.
right? Like, you can't just, trying to think of the best way to say this that makes it clear and concise, but it's like, you can't, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, there's no other way to say that. The proof is in the pudding. And if you're going to sit there and say, well, I earned this, but you have no results, no fruit, no, did you? I don't
Well,
know.
you shouldn't be resting until you've achieved the results. I mean, that's the thing. I think there's like everything, there's two ends of the spectrum, you know, like some men use it as an excuse, but then and so they don't get anything done or they don't achieve what they need to do and they use it as an excuse. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, there's this, you know, there's this idea that you just got to grind all the time, right? You know, rise and grind, blah, blah, you know. I've always been contrarian. I've always been very self-aware. I know myself. And as soon as I went into the business world, when I was 20, 22, 23 years old, I said, guys, let me tell you what's up. I'm a sprinter. I'm never going to run a marathon. That's not how I function. That's not how I operate. I'm going to bust my ass for 2 or 3 hours and I'm going to get more done in 2 or 3 hours than all the grinders will in 12 hours. That's who I am. I don't give a shit if everybody else tells me to grind for 12 hours. No, I'm not a grinder. I'm an apex predator. I'm going to burst and I'm going to go get whatever I need to get done. I'm going to get it done in 2 or 3 hours. And then I'm going to do nothing for the other 20 hours. And I'm going to feel happy about doing nothing for 20 hours. I don't give a shit if you think it's lazy. Beat me. You go work for 12 hours and beat me. I'll do it in 3 hours and I'm going to enjoy the other 21 hours, do what I want. And I'm not going to be guilt tripped into thinking there's anything wrong with it. Sorry.
I went through that growth that you're talking about. Sounds like you had it out the gate. I had to grow into that.
Oh, it goes against everything that you're told as a man, no question.
But I think it's
That's why I
important
think
to hear.
it's been helpful for me that I don't really expose myself to a lot of, you know, you said earlier, you know, fantasy books or, nerdy or whatever. Like I don't read a lot of self-help utilitarian books. I read a lot of fantasy books, you know, like I've never really been exposed to a lot of the what you should do stuff. I've just what works for me and I'm going to drill down into that. I'm just going to plant my feet in concrete. Like this is who I am. This is what I'm good at. This is how I go about winning. And I'm just going to do it. I don't really care how everybody else does.
And I think that's probably the quintessential definition of masculinity that I could ever give. Right? Like if you, like, one of the biggest hurdles that I had, especially coming out the gate, in my kind of journey with Heroes Veritas, is I actually originally started with, I'm going to reclaim masculinity, because I had heard some other coaches say it in the space, and I respected them and I wanted to be in that space. And I got like 2 months in that journey and I was like, man, that's fucking arrogant. And it didn't click with me to say that, because there isn't a person on this planet that can tell me how to be a better man, because I know myself so well, because the way that I function. So like, it seemed very hypocritical for me. And so I realized that there's a route to an outcome. And to your point, like, you know who you are, and it doesn't matter if you tell me I'm lazy or have a problem with me or whatever. I'm going to go do this because I know exactly where this is, and I've planted my flag and I've said, this is my baseline. Prove me wrong and I'll adjust. Like you said, strong
Exactly.
opinions, weak link to them. You'll release it when you have enough information to make adjustments. But it's not on me to own getting that data. It's on you to prove me I'm wrong,
Yeah.
because this is working for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that is quintessentially the masculine, ethos that I could, if I was to define it, would be, is like, it doesn't matter what you're into. It matters what you're willing to have. Actually, your post recently on conviction, it matters what you're willing to have conviction on.
Mm-hmm.
Because whether it's a feminine or masculine, it doesn't matter as far as energy. Like our conversation on art, if you're willing to have the conviction to say, this is me, I don't really give a shit about anybody else. This is the way I do things. This is the way I work. This is the way I like to do things. That's about as masculine as you're going to get, because you're literally saying, this is my will to the world. Nothing's
Yeah.
going to change it but me.
And I think part of I think it's important to understand where that conviction comes from. You know, for me, I can't speak to everybody else. For me, the reason I'm so convicted about the things that I believe about who I am or whatever is because I've spent a lot of time reflecting on it, and I look at my opinions from every possible angle until I'm very objective with myself, until I get to a point where, okay, this is what makes the most sense. I don't do it from a position of arrogance or from a position of being a know-it-all. I seek out criticism. Like, if I'm doing something stupid, I'm not doing it on purpose. I'm doing the absolute I'm not perfect, but I can promise you, I'm trying to be every minute of the day. At the same time, I'm going to mess up. I'm going to do stupid shit. So if I'm doing something stupid, it's because I don't know a better way to do it. So please tell me. And as soon as you show me a better way, I'm going to download that new update into my software, and that's going to be the new operating system from now on. Like, I want to be criticized. So it's part of the reason I have such strong convictions is because I know that I've been brutally honest with myself, that when I've been given feedback, I haven't been defensive and I haven't been arrogant about pushing the right feedback away. And so I'm comfortable with planting my feet in concrete, as I said earlier, and planting my flag on what I'm convicted about, because I truly believe that is the best possible way, based on my experience and all the information I have available. That is the best possible conclusion that I could reach. And that's what allows me to be so strongly convicted about whether it's my own productivity levels or whatever my opinions are. That's where the conviction comes from, is deep reflection and knowing that I've been open-minded and listened to all the possible opinions and feedback and come to the conclusion that really does genuinely make the most sense, not just what I think my opinion is.
And I think there's been a common theme in this conversation, this whole conversation, and pretty much every conversation you and I have had since we started talking, is that ruthless honesty piece.
Mhm.
If you're not ruthlessly honest with yourself, and hold yourself to that striving for perfection, but looking to know you're imperfect, not much is going to change for the better. And I'm very similar to you, where it's, I like I just said, I had to grow into my own personal ethos on things, and the reason for that was that audit system. And it took me a while to allow my audit system to be the most paramount. Whereas I grew up in a space where my audit system was always trumped by something else, right? Whether it was my parents or school or whatever. It took me a while to step into my own and go, no, I've done the work. I've audited this enough times to where I no longer have to question my own baseline. I
Mhm.
know that this is the best answer that I have available to me, because I've gone through the ruthless honesty to look at it from all angles to the best of my ability and say, is this the best thing that I can get, the closest I can get to perfect in this moment? And if that's the case, then to your point, I can plant my flag with ease, because you'd have to prove to me that that audit was incorrect.
Yeah.
And I see that a lot with a lot of guys, where they've allowed their baseline, and I speak from my own experience with a lot of people. When we let our baselines get corrupted by outside influences, it makes it 10 times harder to plant that flag.
Oh, you have no idea where to even start. I mean,
Yeah.
that's why I think it's important. Um, a lot of people ask me what my influences are, and what books I've read and where I got this certain take on something or whatever. And I've always been, I don't know where it came from. Even like you're talking about, you had to learn your own audit system. You can ask my parents. I've always been the way that I am about having my own audit system. Like, I don't know where it came from. I was just born that way. Like, I've just always trusted my own judgment more than anybody else's opinion. Um, I don't know, but I've always been very consistent with kind of blocking out anybody else's opinion of how I should do things. I don't consume a lot of other people's social media content because I want to come up with my own content. I don't want to, and if I expose myself to other people's opinions, the more outside influences there are, the harder it is to know what you really think and what you really care about. And I think that's become harder than ever in the modern day. We're just getting bombarded with all these outside influences. I think it's really important to just cut it off and just go for a drive and don't turn a podcast on. Don't do anything except just let these things, just meditate on these things. In the Bible, Paul talks about, meditate on these things, meditate on these certain things. That means like chew on it. Don't just be aware of it and say, oh, that's really good, and then let it go, you know, proverbial through one ear and out the other. Like, sit and think on something until you, and don't do anything. Don't look at what I say on social media or what somebody says. Like, what do you think?
Yeah.
Just figure out what you think about it. Completely, it's easy to think outside the box when you don't know what the box is. Like, and all these outside influences, there's good stuff in there, but if you're not strict with your discipline on what you allow in, it becomes impossible to know where to plant your flag, because you're just a combination of what other people have told you to be, and you've never just figured out for you who you are. And now more than ever, I think it's really important to spend some time just by yourself, thinking and establishing and kind of building up your foundation to plant your flag on, because nobody's going to do that for you. And if you're not careful, you're just going to be just this haphazard Frankenstein of broken pieces of other people's opinions, and that's not a solid foundation.
I agree 100%. You mentioned the Bible, and even in the Bible, it said Jesus went into the forest for 40 days and 40 nights. There was no social media, no radio, there was none of that. And I really, truly believe that
Moses in the burning bush, same thing. I mean,
the answers are found in the stillness. And I think so many people are, I think I saw a number that says every 3 seconds we're bombarded with a new piece of advertisement or piece of information when we're online. Every 3 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you don't think that that's noise, then you've never truly sat in stillness. And I love drives. Like, that's my thought pattern, right? Like, when I go to speak at events, when I go and attend events, I drive to them. I don't like to fly. And the reason that I drive is because the entire drive, however long it is, it could be 4 hours, it could be all the way up to, I've driven 32 hours before. I don't have podcasts on. I might have music on low, but I'm taking my stillness, and I'm getting ready for the storm to come. And that storm is whatever is going to happen when I get on stage, or whatever is going to happen. But that's my audit. That's me doing that. And then when I consume that information, whether it's a 1-day event or a 3-day event or a speaking engagement, the whole way home is the same thing. I'm sitting with the stillness and I'm auditing. And I think, to your point, that's a skill that's been lost to a lot of people in this generation, is they don't know how to sit by themselves. They don't know how to not have noise.
I mean, and I think, in fairness to the modern generation, I don't think any humans in history would have been immune to it if they would have had the options that we have for being bombarded.
Oh, I'm not saying it's easy by any means to disconnect. I think especially if you grow up into it,
it's a brand new
way.
I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a brand new battle that we're having to forge new ground on. Nobody's ever had to deal with this before. No human beings have ever had to deal with the amount of exposure and distractions and, quick fixes and ease of access to entertainment and mindless, whether it's pornography or, easy access to junk food, or,
it's low risk
with a lot of, we're as humans, we're having to adapt to something right now. And I think we're in the middle of adapting to it. The human beings have never been forced to adapt to before. Like, it was never a problem. Literally, if you go back in time 75 years, and then from there all the way back to the end of history, stillness was never a problem. There was plenty of stillness. There was nothing else to do. This is a brand new thing we're having to figure out, and we're just now starting to realize the consequences of not having it. And all the mental health crisis that we're having now, these are new things that we haven't adapted to yet, and we're having to break new ground.
No,
And
what
I think
I
we
think
are. I mean, push.
I mean, technology has moved faster than evolution, like leaps and
Oh,
bounds. Which, to your point, adaptation is something we're struggling with, something that no other generation in the history of humanity on the entire globe has ever had to deal with. And one of the things that you mentioned just now is the utility of things, right? There was no intentionality needed for stillness because it existed by nature.
yeah.
And we don't just see that in the stillness, we see that in masculine utility too, right? You have the ease of access to things. There is no, you know, protection is almost figurative to some people now,
Oh, for
because we have safety by insulation, not true safety, but we insulate ourselves. And so this, what we're seeing now is kind of this wake up call. As you mentioned, we're adapting as we go through this generation. We're seeing us evolve into, how do we handle this? It's forcing an intentionality, because now we're seeing the outcome of the lack of intentionality, right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Like we have abundance and exuberance when it comes to food, for instance, and now we have a wave of fitness
And
culture
that's
that's
never
coming.
been an issue before. Like for
Never.
most of human history, it was constant survival to not starve to death. So,
Exactly. So the
you know,
systems are built
it's easy to
do the
judge,
goal.
and that's what I'm trying to bring nuance to when I have these conversations. It's like it's easy to sit and judge people who are overweight or who
Yeah.
can't control, their attention span or whatever. Like there's so much condescension when we talk about these things on social media. Like it's easy. It's like, dude, these are things that humans have never had to deal with ever before. This is brand new shit. And we need to have some understanding instead of just being, we treat them like, how do you not know better? It's like, how are we supposed to know better? Nobody's ever dealt with this shit before. Like the two generations max, maybe three,
Yeah.
you
Yeah, I
know?
would say two and a half, because I mean, even in World War II, they had depression and rationing and things of that nature. So it definitely didn't have the level of abundance that we have now. And then, to your point, the abundance of information that we have now, right? And I think that that is kind of a root cause of, or at least a culprit to the ego of what you're talking about, the judgment of, how do you not know that? How are you not doing these things? Because things are so easy to get that you sometimes forget. And I can see where it's easy to forget that with abundance comes options, and with options means that there's a shadowing of other things if you're not exposed to it. Like you
Mhm.
said, if I'm not out there seeking and curating my feed, I can get the worst type of poison in my feed, or I can get the best type of motivation. I may be getting great information that I can implement with a good audit system, or I'm Frankensteining a bunch of thoughts together that maybe aren't serving me the best. And if I
Yeah.
don't know how to discern them one from the other, um, it's easy to get lost in it. And I think that that's what we're
Oh,
learning now, is
human
how
beings
to
aren't
not
built,
get lost in it.
this abundance thing. And I've always been, ever since I got into sales, after I got out of college, I didn't get a degree in college. I played baseball, so I wasn't really focused on school. And so after I got out of college, um, I had to get a job, and the first job I found was in sales, and I didn't know how to sell. I didn't understand anything about it, but I knew what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to be the caricature of a salesman that's shady and sleazy and all that. So I just really started trying to learn people and why they do what they do. And I vividly remember, this will date me a little bit. I vividly remember having my own money after I got that job, and I went to the store to get a digital camera before we had phones in our cameras. And the salesman asked me, like, well, what kind of camera are you looking for? And he started giving me all these options. I'm like, dude, I know nothing. I don't know what a pixel was. Like, I don't know anything about it. Like, I'm here for you to tell me what I should get. I don't want options. That you
Yeah.
think giving me options is helping me, and all it's doing is making me even more overwhelmed. I don't know anything about this. You're the expert. You tell me. And I've used that to my advantage in sales ever since. People, if you poll people, they would tell you they want options. But human beings don't want options. We want the idea of options, but we want it within a limited framework, like either A or B, or A, B, or C. That's it. We can't process more than, there's a reason multiple choice tests only have usually only have 4 answers. Because if there were 7, can you imagine taking a multiple choice test with 70 options and how people would do on that test? Okay.
Oh, even if they knew the
Now,
answer, they would second guess it.
oh yeah. Now apply that to everything in life, because that's
Yeah.
basically what we have. If you want to lose weight and you Google it online, you're not going to get 2 or 3 theories that you might be able to follow on how to lose weight. There's going to be a billion, and you're just going to freeze. And every human being will do that if they're presented with. Now, some people are highly intelligent and they can process maybe an 8-question multiple choice test. But at some point, we all have a limit on how much we can process. And right now, it is an unlimited amount of information and options. And anybody that lets themselves go into the rabbit hole in anything is going to reach a point where their brain melts. It happens to me. It happens to everybody eventually.
Yeah.
There's too much stuff, and we've never had to deal with that issue before. It used to be like if you owned 2 books, you were rich. Now it's the opposite. So there's so many things going on. That's what I try to bring nuance to with a lot of the stuff that I write. It's like, guys, we need to have a lot more grace and compassion and understanding for people. Like, we're dealing with shit that there is no precedent for, that nobody's ever figured out. Like, yeah, you might have figured it out, but dude, good for you. That's awesome. But you can't look down on people for not knowing like what the answer is on a multiple choice question with 70 answers. Like, dude, it's not unreasonable that people are overwhelmed by this shit. It's
not at all. Not at all. Like, the best example that I've ever heard in regards to that was learning to play guitar. If somebody gives you a guitar and you've never touched a guitar before and they said play anything you want, you're going to get overwhelmed because you have no knowledge.
Yeah.
On the other pole, if conversely, if you knew 1,000 songs and somebody said play whatever you want, you have so much to choose from. You start to wonder, like, what kind of music do they like, and all these other things. You get overwhelmed by the choice. Yeah. Versus if you only know 3 songs, you're probably going to play the one that you like the best or you're the best at. So now it's easy to make a decision. You're not going to get all anxious about it.
Yeah, right? So you got to straddle this line between like freedom and limitations,
and it's almost like a temporary limitation, right? Like, you almost have to, that old adage of, in order for an arrow to fly forward, it has to be pulled backwards. You almost have to constrain yourself for a moment for whatever the outcome is that you're looking for, right? Like, if you want to learn how to play guitar, or you want to learn what your thought process is on a certain, philosophy or construct, you almost have to dive into that, constrain yourself to that task in that moment, come to a conclusion before moving on to figuring out the other stuff. Otherwise, burnout and overwhelming is going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's a beautiful takeaway from this conversation, at least for me personally. Like that applies to everything. That applies to your prioritization of fitness, your food, information, your relationships, your business, like everything. You need to limit your options so that you can make progress, because otherwise you're going to get overwhelmed. And I personally recently went through this when I expanded on the Heroes Veritas vision. There was so much possibility before I constrained it to the new vision that I was too split apart.
Yeah.
And I had so much that I had in the fire and back burner and all this stuff that I didn't know what to do. And now I've like constrained it. And now I know exactly what I need to be doing, right? I need to be doing podcasts. I need to be doing newsletters. I need to be getting my name out there, speaking more often. Great. Okay, cool. There are days now where I get 6 podcast interviews done, and that's a super productive day. And before, I'm done at 7. Before, I would have been like, okay, I need to go back and work on the website and do all this other stuff. Yeah. Now I'm like, no, that was a super productive day. I'm going to come play video games with my buddies.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with it.
Not at all. Like, and in fact, I find that to go full circle to our original conversation of like the burnout, it affords me so much more creativity within my business. I come up with new ideas of expansion and adding key value to the value proposition to the people that I want to serve. And that only came out of the fact that I set my stuff down for a moment, completely disconnected, went and just shot the shit with my buddies, and had a good time. And then a light bulb happens.
it's like nobody has ever watched an NFL team and said, well, why don't you play every day?
Right.
You
Right.
know, nobody thinks somebody in the NFL is a pussy because he needs a few days to recover after a game. You know what I mean? Like we
Yeah.
understand very reasonably that even the best athletes in the world, they can only take so much punishment before they've got to ice their knees, before they've got to, stretch, have therapy, get some sleep, get some, calories, get a Gatorade, whatever. Like it doesn't even cross our minds to think those guys are weak because they can't play a football game every day, right? Like that would be insane for anybody to suggest otherwise. But when it comes to our work ethic in our personal lives, we basically treat ourselves as if we were treating the NFL player for not playing a double header. Like, can you imagine an NFL double header or a triple header? No, nobody would ever dream to expect that. But we do that to ourselves where you, like you said, you do 7 podcasts and you think you need to do more. Like that's a problem. That's a
Yeah.
problem that the fact that we've even considered, like, if you played in the NFL, you wouldn't tell yourself, I need to go play another NFL game right now to be a good NFL player. Like that's insane. It doesn't even make any sense. But somehow that's gotten infused into our mindset as human beings. And that's not just a masculine thing. Women, I feel like, struggle with that even more so
I think
than
just
men.
humans do. I think it's
You
how
know,
we calibrated success.
and it's and if you compare it to anything objective like an NFL game or whatever, it's like it really is ridiculous that we've even gotten to the point where we feel that pressure. Like it makes no logical, objective sense in any way to think that we can endlessly grind and that there's anything wrong with resting. That's stupid. An
I agree.
NFL player can't play next week if he doesn't rest. Even in the NFL, when they do the Thursday night games now, that's been pretty recent. A lot of the players have been like, "Dude, this is terrible for our health. I can't go from Sunday and playing on Thursday. 3 days in between isn't enough rest for me to recuperate and not get injured.
Yeah.
They need the full 6 days. Why do we think that we can do otherwise just because it's our minds?"
I think you hit the nail on the head when you used the example that you used, right? Like NFL is held to a high standard. We look to them as the standard of peak physical and athletic ability. We look to them as the cream of the crop, right? So you would never look at somebody who's going all out, leaving it on the gridiron and playing at the elite level and say, oh, well, they'll just come back and play again in an hour. And going back to your comment earlier is like, where's the fruit? I think where most people have an issue is they conflate what they deliver as success, like what they define as success, with their energy levels. For instance, 7 podcasts takes a lot of time. It's an hour of podcast, that's 7 hours of work. And then I'll feel like I need to do more, right? That was old me. I've backed into that a little bit differently. And it wasn't because I didn't think that I was invincible. And it wasn't because I didn't think that I didn't get enough, or it was because I thought I didn't get enough done. Because to me, my calibration of effort was not, Tim, you're playing at NFL level, so you deserve a 6-day break. It was, you could give more. And that to me is the calibration piece of it, of what we define as what is elite performance for ourselves, and really bringing it and owning it and being ruthlessly honest about what it is for ourselves. Because like you said, you can do what some people only need 12 hours to do. You can do it in 5 hours. So your elite competence is different than, Joe Schmo's elite competence. And we allow the outside influences, this going back to that conviction of your baseline, to determine what we decide is successful and what we decide is our NFL level.
That's a good point. I
Play.
mean, that's probably the hardest part is if you don't intentionally set aside if you don't intentionally define what success is, then you don't know when you hit it. It's, I mean, you've got to define what the target is to know when you've hit it or not. Because otherwise you can be bullseyeing it all day long. And if you don't know that's the target, you're going to think you're not doing a good enough job. There's nothing to compare to. And I think of it, one of the ways I think of it is, when you think about, money, You know, most people, I hope, budget their money, right? And so if you make, and I'm just going to use easy numbers to do the math. If you make $10,000 a month, and your house payment is $4,000, and your car payments are $2,000, and your food is $2,000, and then you've got $2,000 left over for everything else. Like, you don't have the money to spend $5,000 going to Hawaii,
Right.
but you don't sit and beat yourself up that you're not in Hawaii. You understand, I have a limited amount of money, I have a finite amount of money. X amount has to go to these things. The rest, I'm choosing to do these other things. And when I'm out of money, that's all the money there is. I don't sit and spend I don't sit and spend hours beating myself up that there's not more money to, buy sports memorabilia or a Lamborghini. Like, it just is what it is, right?
I think that's a fantastic analogy and
When
an
it comes to
example
our
of
effort,
that's
we
how
have
they
to
look at it.
realize, like, I've only got 10 good hours in me or 5 good hours in me. And when they're spent, they're spent. So the most important thing for me is making sure I prioritize things in a way that I spend that 5 hours on the most important things. And when those are done, I'm going to go, for a hot air balloon ride. It doesn't matter what I do after that.
Yeah.
I've done what I needed to do. And if I want to go have a water gun fight with my neighbors for the rest of the day, there's nothing irresponsible about that. I've paid my bills. The
Yep.
bills are paid. If I have an extra $5,000, I can have a do whatever I want to do with it. And it's not irresponsible because the things that matter have been taken care of. I've defined what they are. And everything else I can if I want to sleep all day, then I'm going to. I can do whatever I want. I can go play video games with my friends. It doesn't become irresponsible if you have it prioritized the right way. And that's the part I don't think it is very difficult because it's completely subjective to each individual on what their priorities are. But I do think it's important to get to budget your energy in the same way you would budget your money and allow yourself the freedom to say, I'm out of energy. I've spent it in the right place today, and that's all I've got. And all I can do now is rest until tomorrow.
I love that analogy. I think that's super profound. I was like,
Thank you.
it's easy for people to understand an energy budget if you put it in financial terms. I
Yeah.
think that's a really great way of looking at that. Well, on that note, I want to be respectful of your time. This conversation, I feel like could go forever. I could talk to you forever. This has been
Me too.
immensely powerful for me. And I really appreciate the way you've articulated things for me. I have a lot of things to go back and think about myself. So before we close out though, um, could you give like 3 tips? I mean, you've brought a lot of value here already to the audience that you think would really help people kind of revolutionize where they're at, wherever they're at, wherever they want to go. Just 3 high-level tips that you think would be kind of quick hit items for people.
Um, in in talking with kind of in what we just said, with the time energy budget, one of the best things I've ever heard as far as advice is, um, if you imagine a jar, and I saw a YouTube video of this. Guy's on stage doing a presentation. There's a big jar there. He puts a bunch of big rocks in this jar, and he's in front of an audience. And he said, "Is this jar full?" Everybody says yes. And so he pulls gravel out and he pours gravel in, and shakes it around, asks the audience, "Is the jar full?" Well, they're on to the idea now. So, long story short, he goes from gravel to sand to eventually to water and fills it all the way up until there's no more room for anything else. And he asked the audience, you know, what's the moral of this story? And they say, you can always fit in more. He said, no. The moral of this story is that if I hadn't put the big rocks in first, it never would have fit. That's in line with kind of what we're talking about. You've got to take the time. There's like we said, there's all these things coming at us. Everything feels urgent. You have to stop and make a point to take the time to fill out your budget, to figure out what the big rocks are in your life, and let those things be enough. You've got to kind of, and that this kind of just sums up all of our whole conversation. You got to block out too many competing interests. You've got to pick what matters to you the most, and you've got to let yourself prioritize those things. The other thing I would say, as far as the takeaway, would be um, really, really being ruthless with looking in the mirror. And I wrote a post about this. And so, it was in a book called Good to Great by Jim Collins. And one of the common threads with all businesses that were the most successful were that they looked in the mirror, not the window. And we've gotten into a point in society where we're always looking out the window, pointing at everybody else, instead of just looking in the mirror and controlling what we can control. Um, and that's the other thing I think would be the most helpful for, at least the feedback that I've gotten from my audience is um, just ruthlessly self-examining and not judging other people, and not, being condescending, just looking at yourself and being honest with yourself and fair with yourself about where you are and how you can improve. Look in the mirror and just focus on what's in the mirror. And if you relentlessly and exclusively focus on what you can control, then everything else, first of all, everything else will take care of itself. But second of all, that's all you can do anyway. Is what you can do is all you can do. And there's a lot of peace to be had when you realize, like, I've done everything I can do. It's out of my hands now. There's a lot of peace to be had in that mentality of, once you know you've done everything you can, then just be done. You can't do anything else anyway. So whatever happens is going to happen either way.
Fantastic. Wow. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Such a valuable episode. I really hope everybody watching got as much value as I did from it. As always, I would love to have you back. I could talk to you forever, man. Like, this stuff is great. I think this has been a great conversation for me personally. Do you have any big projects coming up that you want to let people know about? Anything that you're working on right now other than the social media?
Well, the social media is kind of in preparation for a book. That was the impetus for me starting the social media. Was I'm writing a book to my boys, um, based on a series of notes that I've been keeping for 13 years, just with lessons that I wanted to teach them to prepare them for life. And the book is going to be called The Wisdom of Kings. It's meant to be kind of a family legacy thing, something to pass down to, for them to teach their kids and things like that, like a kind of like a book of Proverbs, but for our family. Like, here's who we are, what we stand for, what we believe in.
Love it.
And I've been kind of compiling that since I knew I was going to have a son. Just wanted him to have something that when he went out on his own, he had kind of a manual for, how to be ready for life. And so as I've learned certain lessons, as I was learning them, I made notes about them, because my kids are still too young. My kids are 11 and 13. So most of these things are way too deep, and way too deep for them to process. So I'm still not at a point where I can have these in-depth conversations with them yet, but I want to get it on paper so that if anything happens to me, they have it, and just something for them to kind of pass down through our family. Hopefully it's, when, as a book, it can help more than just my family, but that's my only big project right now.
That's amazing, man. Keep me posted on that. I'll obviously see it and stay in contact with you. I want you back on the podcast. But I definitely want to support that, because that sounds amazing.
I appreciate it, bro.
Yeah, of course. Well, amazing conversation. I really enjoyed it. Again, I want to be respectful of your time. Be sure to check out The Wisdom of Kings on Instagram, and make sure to follow, because obviously he's got a lot of knowledge, got a lot of things to share. Also got a book coming out that I think is going to be really critical and profound for people, not only just to your sons, but for the world. And looking forward to talking with you and growing with you and supporting your movement and supporting your book and supporting everything you're doing, because this was a great episode for me personally. So thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, man. I feel the same way.
Awesome. Well, as always, like, comment, share, subscribe, check out the YouTube, the Apple, Spotify, wherever platform we loaded the podcast on. And we'll check you guys later on Here's Veritas Podcast.